Welcome everybody to tonight's double keynote, which is obviously one of the highlights of this conference. Please take your seats. My name is Reina Balberg. I'm chair of the Commission for Integration and for Migration and Integration Research at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And it's my task also to chair this first double keynote. Let me just mention immediately, there is a second pair of keynotes with a focus on the future of migration research, which will be on Wednesday morning. So that's the second really important highlight of this conference. And please be sure that you're all there on Wednesday morning. I was also asked by the conference, by the hosts of the conference, to again tell you that tomorrow evening, so this is Tuesday evening, there will be a Heurigen, which is a kind of wine cellar. It's usually open air, but maybe given the weather conditions, it might be actually inside. Yes, and if you want to have this very peculiar Austrian experience, you are supposed to register. Please try to register today for it. And I think it's also self-paying. But it's also an important part of the conference in terms of social events. So let me now finally welcome our keynote speakers. You see only one of them. This is Ettore Recchi, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But let me also mention that our second keynote speaker, Ayelet Shachar, is already online, together with a number of her students who are also listening in and taking this double keynote as part of their classes at the University of Toronto. The title of this session is The New Border Regimes, Walls, Bridges and Tolls, Exploring the Global Structure of State Border Control. This will be Ettore's first talk, and then Ayelet will talk about shifting borders and new conceptions of territoriality. We've reversed the order of keynote speakers. It makes more sense both to start maybe with the more empirically oriented keynote and then to follow up with the more normative legal theory oriented talk by Ayelet. And also maybe in terms of the technology, it's better to have the Zoom presentation by Ayelet as a second one. So, Ettore Recchi, he is professor of sociology at Sciences Po in Paris. He's also affiliated, he's a part-time professor with the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence. He got his PhD from the EUI in social and political sciences, and he has taught and researched at the University of Florence, the University of Chieti Pescara, the EUI, the University of Michigan, Gonzaga University, UCLA, Universidad Complutense, Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, and the Warsaw School of Social Psychology. It's a long list. He has been on the academic circuit for quite a while. But most importantly, his focus in terms of substance of his research is on human mobility in a broad sense in its different forms, including such things that we wouldn't think of, such as cognitive mobility, for example, and how people connect across borders without actually moving necessarily. So I learned a lot. I've learned a lot from Ettore's research on human mobility, social stratification, elites, and European integration, nearly always in a comparative perspective across several European countries. Ettore works a lot with data, large scale, large N, quantitative data, and analyzes them. And he has been a leader of multiple research projects on mobility. Let me just mention the most important one. They all have very suggestive names. One is Pionnier, if I pronounce it the French way, yeah, because you know the last syllable is EUR, right? So referring to the European Union in it. Move Act, UCross, global mobilities, and more recently he has also been involved in projects on the relation between COVID-19 and mobility. His books, there are at least two very important books that I would suggest you look up on the internet, and even better, get them from your library, or even better, buy them and read them. They're still not out of stock, I suppose. One is Mobile Europe, the Theory and Practice of Free Movement in the European Union. It was published in 2015. And the other one is co-authored with Adrian Fevell and Fulya Apayedin and others, Everyday Europe, Social Transnationalism in an Unsettled Continent. Ettore has been associated with the Global Mobilities Project at the MPC, the Migration Policy Center in Florence, focusing on visa regimes and cross-border infrastructures. So trying to examine how borders actually filter movements across them, what kind of devices are used, and what kind of structures are in the background to make these border regimes work or sometimes not work. And I think this will be also probably the focus of your talk. I'm very much looking forward to that. And I'll introduce Ayelet when it's her turn to speak. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Reina, for the extensive, even too extensive and nice introduction. Thanks to the organizing committee for the invite. Thanks to the audience for being here. I'm very happy and honored to be with you tonight. I'm also pleased to share this keynote with Ayelet Shachar, whom I greatly admire as a scholar. Yes, Reiner already anticipated that what I'm going to present today are outcomes from a project I've been directing at the Migration Policy Center of European University Institute over the last 4 years, the Global Mobilities Project. And I also have to acknowledge two of my collaborators in this project, who are co-authors of a data collection and analysis I will present. Emanuel Deutschmann, who's currently at the University of Flensburg in Germany, and Lorenzo Gabrielli, who is a member of a Joint Research Center of European Commission in Ispra, Italy. I also have to acknowledge that Reiner was of a kickoff meeting of this project, and he gave us insightful advice on what followed, and I will present, among other things that we delivered as part of a project. You can find on the website of a project if you're interested in different aspects of global mobility. The philosophy behind the project is to explore, as I said, different facets of global mobility, and also the boundaries that constrain and limit global mobility. At the start of the project was greatly inspired by an article written by Ron and Shamir, and you have a quote here: "The differential ability to move in space has become, in contemporary societies, a major stratifying force of a global social hierarchy." And why is it like this? There is an easy answer and a shorthand answer, which is because there are states, and a primary and almost quintessential aspect of a state is controlling and surveilling the borders and defining what are the entry rights and the settlement rights of outsiders. This is the very stateness of modern states, as John Torpey reminded us. So there are mobility divides in the world, and these divides are mostly institutionalized through two mechanisms: physical borders and visas. And actually, my presentation consists of two separate smaller presentations on two upshots of a global mobilities project, one on land borders and one on visas. I will start with land borders. I like very much this quotation from somebody who had been studying visas before me, Stephen Mao. Borders are sorting machines. And this idea fits in well with the reality that no border is completely sealed or completely open. And there is a variability in the openness, or as we prefer to say, the permeability of borders. And in my presentation, I will dig deeper into this idea and how we can conceptualize and measure the permeability of physical borders between states. Border research is a large field, which encompasses different styles of research. There is research which focuses on the social legal aspects of border control. For instance, research carried out by two prominent scholars that I really appreciate, Elspeth Guild and Didier Bigot. There is research which is more inspired by anthropological takes on borders and boundary setting, ethnicity, gender, intersectionality, which is research on the social cultural construction of borders, not necessarily in geographical border spaces. And a prominent scholar in the area is Gerard Delanty, but also Sandro Mezzadra, for instance. And there is more realistic, there are more realistic approaches to border research, which focus on border fortification. This is more common among international relations scholars. Our approach, the approach in a project, is closer to this third stream of research. A major takeaway of this style of research is that we are living in the era of bordered, of fenced or fortified borders, the era of walls. And the irony is that this era started with the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you look at this graph, it shows a long-term evolution in the number of fortified borders globally. And you see that it was minimal until the late 80s and then started to soar uninterruptedly. And currently, about 20% of world borders have some sort of fortification. I mean, they're not entirely fortified, but may have some barbed wires or proper walls. But our approach differs a little bit from the pre-existing studies of fortified borders. This is important to study walls, but I think we think that it's also important, or even more important, to look at the infrastructures that allow people and goods to go across borders. And so we focus on, and why this? Because eventually, at the end of the day, what matters, if you're interested in global flows and human mobility flows, and migration as part of human mobility flows, is whether people can go through borders or not. And walls are not necessarily meaningful because you have two images here. The first image is the image of what happened the day after the end of the Berlin Wall. Actually, the Berlin Wall ended on November 9, 1989, but the wall was not destroyed overnight. Actually, the only thing that changed was that the gates were open and people could flow through these gates, as you see from the picture. So if you only looked at the walls, you couldn't see any change. If you look at the infrastructure, you could see a real change that these people going through them. The other picture is a more recent picture of a just completed bridge across the Zambezi River between Zambia and Botswana. It was opened in May 21, I think. And that was an almost impenetrable border because of the river, but now it gives an opportunity for people and goods to go through these natural border. So if we stylize the type of borders that you may find between two countries, we may start from a situation A in which you have an ideal 100 kilometers border. We know cross-border infrastructure. Occasionally, people can go through this border. They can walk through. Maybe they can have I don't know, some sort of vehicle going through it, but there is no infrastructure. You can hardly think of any systematic border passage. Situation B, you have a road, so that increases the permeability of a border. Situation C, you have many roads, possibly higher permeability and more people and goods flowing through. Situation D, you have also a railway, even increased permeability. Situation E, you have a red point, which is a checkpoint. And maybe these limits the permeability. And situation F, you have many checkpoints on all cross-border infrastructure, and most likely this is a harder border to cross. So we try to formalize the possible variability in the permeability of borders through a formula, which is a straightforward formula. Don't be scared by the math. There is not much math involved. BPI, Border Permeability Index, the main components is a factor I, which stands for the number of cross-border infrastructure, that is the roads or pathways or railways that go through a land border, minus the number of checkpoints, the C factor, which is multiplied by a factor E, which takes control or controls for the degree of enforcement of these checkpoints. I mean, checkpoints can vary from being very strict and basically barring access and crossings, or can be relaxed and open, and everybody and every good can go through the border. Divided by a factor L, which stands for the length of the border, and multiplied by a standardizing factor, which keeps the range of an index between 0 and 1. And we calculated this formula for all borders on this planet, state borders. And there are 312 land borders between sovereign states. And we could get information on what's on the border in terms of streets, paths, railways, ferries as well, by online open access maps that are very much used by geographers and planners, OpenStreetMap and the other world map. And we also integrated it with an additional data set by the World Food Program, which has a lot of information about checkpoints that we found out were not available on more regular maps, especially for Africa. And we counted all these infrastructures every 500 meters, which means that there were 2 roads in a 500-meter range. We just counted 1. For the geographers in the room, these maps detail 38 different types of infrastructures, and we decided to weight these infrastructures in terms of their of the accessibility of the amount of flows that they can permit. So highways and railways were given a factor of 1, secondary roads a factor of 0.8, footways 0.5, and minor paths a factor of 0.3. We carried out analysis with both the weighted and unweighted index, and the results are extremely similar. So weighting is not really something that changes results. It's a lot of work to get the information on all the land borders with a 500-meter scale. So we managed to get an automatized algorithm or API to extract the information, to scrape, as data scientists say, the information from the world maps. And the procedure looks brilliant, but then we decided, well, we better have a second look visually. And we found out that, in fact, we needed to redo the process entirely visually because there were a lot of false positives and false negatives. So the message is, whenever you rely on API or automatized process, please check. And false positives because a number of roads, for instance, stopped right at the border. They didn't cross the border, but according to the API, they went across. And false negative because for some reasons, many different reasons, the automatized process didn't recognize some border infrastructures, including ferries, for instance. So we did all the work again manually. It was a painstaking work. And eventually, these are the maps of the different borders. Eventually, we came out with 30,000 something cases of border crossing infrastructures of the different types all over the planet, and 2,500 checkpoints. So I come to the results. The first result, or the first takeaway of the results, is that there is a huge difference in the permeability of borders by continents. It is possibly no surprise that Europe is by far the continent with the most permeable borders worldwide. It's perhaps slightly more surprising that African borders are much more permeable than Asian and American borders. If you look at the graph, you see that the graph has an horizontal axis. What is the horizontal axis? The horizontal axis shows changes in the border permeability index depending on the variation of enforcement level of checkpoints. Now, we don't have any prima facie or direct information on how enforced are checkpoints. They would require quite a lot of additional work. But we experimented with different levels and we speculated how the index could change by varying these parameters. As you can see, the only place or the only continent in which the level of enforcement of checkpoints changes or affects the index overall is North America. And why? Because in North America, there are quite a number of checkpoints. And it's the bottom graph. You can see that in North America, you have 15 checkpoints every 1,000 kilometers of border, whereas in Africa, you only have 4, and in Asia, 6. Europe is not that far, actually, 12, but still North America leads. So you may ask yourself, what are the most permeable world borders? Again, very much in line with what I showed in the previous slide, European borders, and especially borders with small states, Spain and Andorra, Luxembourg and France, Luxembourg and Belgium. No surprise here. You have 2 rankings, actually, following from what I said before, depending on how we set the enforcement level of checkpoints, whether we consider that checkpoints are relaxed or strict. And maybe the interesting takeaway of this slide is that even in a case which we know is quite rare, even though we just had some examples during COVID, border control is not enforced within Europe, still European borders are the most permeable in the world. And some African borders also feature in this ranking. What happens on the opposite side of the spectrum? What are the least permeable borders of the world? There we see some difference in the border dyads or country pairs depending on the level of enforcement of checkpoints. For instance, you see, if we assume that checkpoint control is loose, then the less permeable borders are borders where you have long stretches of impenetrable land, like between Venezuela and Guyana, or Suriname and Brazil. But if we consider, as we know, that it's most likely that checkpoint control can be very strict and make borders tight, then the most closed or least permeable world borders are the borders in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iraq and Jordan, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And you may notice that in some cases, we have the border permeability index goes below 0, which is a little bit of an anomaly. Why that? Simply because we found on the maps cases, like the cases where the coefficient is negative, in which we find checkpoints even in the absence of cross-border infrastructures, which is an indicator of a strictness of a land border control in those countries. The next step in the analysis is to explain why some borders are more permeable than others. And we took on board 4 different classes of factors that may affect the permeability of borders: economic factors, political factors, mobility and population factors, and cultural factors. I will go into the details of these by showing you regressions of these factors on the border permeability index. Consider that the unit of analysis are country pairs, that is the borders between country A and country B. So first class of factors, economic factor. We speculated that border permeability is lower when you have borders between countries that have high income differentials. And this is the case. You can see, I don't have a beamer, unfortunately, but you can see the GNI, gross national income gap. The coefficient is negative, confirming our expectation, but not that significant. What is most significant, in fact, is the gross national income per capita, and also the gross national income per capita square. What does this mean? It means that the minus sign of the first coefficient, -5 something, shows that the poorer the countries, the higher the permeabilities. And the second coefficient, the GNI squared, shows that the countries that are very rich, in fact, squared, you square the GNI, are also actually likely to have highly permeable border. I'll come back to this in my conclusions. Then we have factors relating to the economist unit, democracy index, and yes, democratic countries have more open borders. Countries that share in membership of international government organization also have more open borders. Countries that have higher population density, we expect these to exert some pressure towards creating infrastructures to go out of the country. That is also significant. And then we also introduced another data set where we produced as part of a global mobility project that shows the flows between countries. The higher the flows, the higher the possibility to have the likelihood of having permeable borders. And contrarily, in line with these, also lower tourist visa costs also correlate with more permeable borders. In fact, the 2 cultural factors that we speculated could be conducive to more permeable borders, that is having the same language or having the same religion from a majority population do not affect the permeability of borders. The final model draws on all these factors that were analyzed separately in separate regression models and confirmed the significance of the factors that I just mentioned. Okay, let me come to the second part of my presentation. I try to speed up, maybe because I'm a bit late. It's about visas. Visas are forms of remote state control. It's a device, a visa, to transfer state control from borders to the origins of movements. This is something that is generalized worldwide and involves a number of different parts, not only states, because states also subcontract this work, especially to carriers, and especially carriers in the aviation sector, but not only aviation. So there is some privatization of traditional state function, but possibly this is something that Ayelet will discuss. Data on visas have been already analyzed. Matthias Zaika is in the audience. He has been working on this as part of a DEMIC project. Stefan Mao and collaborators also work on these. What has been especially analyzed is visa waivers. And over time, visa waivers have expanded since the 1960s. They were stopped for a while in the 1970s with the oil crisis and the migration crisis that followed, but then continued to expand, but continued to expand only for a minority of countries and citizens of these countries. And so progressively, what this graph shows, taken from work by Gülsau and Mao, is that whereas in 1969, the majority of countries had something like 20 to 25 visa waiver destination through the passport. In the 2010 and even more in 2020, there is a clear bifurcation. In a number of countries, you have limited visa waiver travel opportunity, but also there are quite a number of countries in which you have a lot, more than 80 visa waiver destinations. And this is a clear divide between the global south and the global north. OECD countries have seen a progressive expansion of the citizens of these countries, of a destination they can go to without a visa, whereas citizens of African countries have seen since the 1960s actually a decline in the number of countries where they can go freely without a visa. We expand on this, considering that in fact, it's not only the lifting of visa constraint that is significant as a possible deterrence to travel and mobility. We also think that states use the cost of visa as a way of handling and shaping human mobility globally. So what we did was actually in 2019 to collect, how long I have? I cannot read. 5 minutes, okay. We collected from government websites of each country all the possible information about the cost of visa for different types of visas. And we also consulted consulate website to get additional information. We created a data set that is freely available on the Global Mobilities Project website. About 85,000 visas worldwide for all sovereign states in the world, especially tourist visas whose information is the most easily available. And we have information about about 2/3 of all possible country pairs for tourist visas. Okay, results. First result is states are relatively generous to offer visa waivers when the risk for having travelers settle down and work in their country is limited. So 75% of countries give free transit visas, 49% give free tourist visas, but only 24% of countries or country dyads, actually we are speaking about country pairs, give free work visas. And also the cost of visas increases progressively as you move from transit to tourist to business to work visas. A second takeaway of analysis is that the cost of visas is very clearly negatively correlated with the gross national income per capita of countries. The richer the country, the cheaper the visas are for the citizens. And we call this the Matthew effect in visa cost. And I'll be more specific. If you live in Western Europe, on average, the visa cost you have to face if you want to travel abroad is $14, $15. If you live in Southern Asia, the average is $53. This may look like a relatively modest difference, but it is not if you translate this amount in cost of living and wages. And we have this done in this map. So you can see that, for instance, for Europeans and North Americans, Canadian, Australian, Japanese, to have a visa to go on an average destination, you need to work about 10% of a day. That is less than an hour a day. And with such work, you can afford yourself a visa. But if you live in Central Africa or in some parts of Asia, you need to work between 25 and 70 days to apply for a visa, not to get a visa, to apply for a visa. So I reach my conclusions. I go back to my first part of the presentation, land borders. We have found that there are substantial regional differences. Europe and Africa are have relatively open borders, and the Americas, the least permeable borders. What matters the most to determine how permeable borders are economic factors. And yes, the differentials in income between countries, but also the level of economic development. And actually for different reasons, because poorer countries cannot afford to build up infrastructure to cross the borders. Remember the Zambezi River, that bridge was built by Koreans, not by the Zambian or the Botswanan government. And whereas rich countries have incentives to open the borders because these feeds their economic and social exchanges. I have a caveat on this part of analysis, checkpoints. We don't have information, as I already highlighted, on the degree of enforcement of checkpoints. So we only speculate about it, and we experiment with different levels of enforcement. And we also suspect that many checkpoints, especially flying checkpoints, for instance, between Israel and Palestine, are not included in the open access maps. And about visas, we know that visa waivers have been on the increase over the last decades, but these increases only concern or give advantages to the citizens of the global north. But citizens of the global south not only suffer from the lack of visa waivers, they only suffer from relatively much higher costs of application for visa. I want to insist on application because our analysis is still limited to the cost for requiring a visa. But we know that there are extra costs. For instance, costs in terms of time, how long it takes to get a visa, costs in terms of getting to the office or have access to an agency that can mediate for access to a consulate, and also extra costs like bringing sufficient amount of money to be accepted at the border, or having hotel reservations to actually be admitted into the country. So our analysis is possibly conservative, and global mobility divides, which exist according to our analysis, that are exposed by this analysis as possibly starker than this. Thank you so much.
So much, Ettore. Because we are a little bit behind schedule now, I will still briefly, but only briefly, introduce Ayelet Shachar, who is the second keynote speaker, and I hope in the meantime the technician will be able to show her face also on the screen. So Ayelet has the Harney Chair in Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies, and is also Professor of Law, Political Science and Global Affairs at University of Toronto, where she formerly held the Canada Research Chair in Citizenship and Multiculturalism. She was also, until quite recently, one of the 3 directors of the Max Planck Institute on the study of religious and ethnic diversity in Göttingen. And something that I really need to point out, in 2019, she was the winner of the Leibniz Award, which is one of the most prestigious science prizes in Germany. Currently, she's also affiliated with the Goethe University in Frankfurt, with the Normative Orders Research Center, where she is the leader of the Transformations of Citizenship research group. Ayelet has published a lot, but let me just mention her 3 major books that many of you will have seen, hopefully also read. The first one was on multicultural jurisdictions. The second one, The Birthright Lottery. And the third one, which is actually a dialogue with respondents to a lead essay, is called The Shifting Border: Legal Cartographies of Migration and Mobility. And obviously, the third book and her follow-up research on this was also a main reason why we invited her to this keynote. We decided that the 2 keynotes would be given back to back. I'd rather say face to face, which is you also talk to each other on Zoom in order to coordinate your talks with each other, because obviously they both focus on the changing nature of borders in the current stage of globalization. And that was important for us to have in order to kind of highlight the motto of the conference, globalization of borders and the borders or limits of globalization. Ayelet, the floor is yours, and I hope that you can also stick to 30 minutes or maybe even a little bit less, and we will then still have at least 15 minutes for Q&A with the audience. We don't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Hello, Ayelet.
Wonderful. Hello, Prince. Thank you so much for having me and my classes here with me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Reiner, for that generous introduction. And thank you also for the organizing committee for the invitation and the tech group for making this possible. As you can imagine, I would have been quite delighted to be with you. It looks like a beautiful auditorium. I know it's a beautiful part of the world, which I have not yet visited. So hopefully I'll have a future opportunity to do so, but we do have an ocean dividing us. So I'm very delighted that the virtual tools allow us to be together for this presentation. What I'll do today in my short talk is, let's see, I'm trying to move my, there we go. What I'll do in this short presentation is I'll speak to you about some of the key arguments and findings in my latest book, which is the Shifting Border book. I think we have a bit of a delay, so I'm trying to just return us back to the previous screen. There we go. So the Shifting Border book, and I have this image here because I received this book on March 6, 2020. This was literally a week before the world's borders started to shut down. So I had to show this with you. This was the first time I received my book, but I also included a couple of other publications because to some extent, and really following up on Ettore's wonderful talk, the concern about global inequality in access to citizenship by birthright was a topic that concerned me in the birthright lottery. And the Shifting Border looks at questions of borders, the regulation of mobility, migration, access to protection for asylum seekers. And I also couldn't resist, I included here the Oxford Handbook of Citizenship. I put it here because Reiner and I are co-editors of that Oxford Handbook, and also a recent conference on questions of borders, territory, and rights, continuing the conversation based on some of the arguments developed in the Shifting Borders. So what I'll do in our short time together is I want to take you on a journey with me, which explores certain elements of public law. So we already heard a lot about the trends, the global trends in terms of restriction of mobility. And I want to add here the legal dimension. And I'll rely on three different elements of public law: legislation, regulation, and case law. And I want to suggest to you that these have become central tools in reinventing key dimensions of sovereignty in the modern state. And I'm thinking specifically about territoriality and border control. And as we just heard, and actually, Ettore, I was so glad you started with the Ronen Shamir, because that's an early piece in 2005, already suggesting that there's a concern about inequality in mobility. And more specifically, in terms of my talk, I'll divide it into three parts. I want to first share with you the gist of the argument of the book, both conceptual and theoretical. That's the beginning of that book. Then I'll provide three examples from some of the world's most highly desired destination countries, the United States, Canada, and Australia, looking at how they regulate mobility. And then as time permits, I also want to talk to you very briefly about borders in the time of COVID-19. Obviously, we're all very delighted that the pandemic hopefully is behind us, but I think some of the lessons, some of the practice, some of the techniques of regulations that we have seen are actually going to stay with us for a very extended period of time. And specifically, if we have time, I'll talk to you about a term which I use in the book, a new way of governing mobility, which I refer to as the individualized border. So let's dive into it. So first of all, in terms of the conceptual framework, most of you will be familiar with two prevalent models which we find in the literature, which I refer to as the static border and the disappearing border. So I'll say, just very briefly remind you or explain what it is that I mean by using these terms. So the static model is pretty much a rearticulation of the classic Westphalian image of the border. So under this account, we have a visible barrier. So this is the infrastructural element that Ettore mentioned. We have a visible barrier on the country's frontier. And if you want a visual image, think about the Great Wall of China. That's a classic example. It's a fixed, massive barrier that has served for many years as a powerful symbol of control and authority. Of course, in Europe, you can think about the Berlin Wall. Again, a fortified visible barrier. It was, of course, a barrier that ran as a scar in the heart of a divided city. It was also a violent border in a very immediate way. That is, of course, you may recall, of course, you know, given where you are, border guards would have basically automatically would shoot anyone who would have approached that border without permission. Now, today's borders, the borders that I will describe to you, are no longer violent in this direct way. However, although they are less visible, I want to suggest to you that they exert their own violence in ways and violence, and they are deadly, but in different ways, in far less visible ways, making it actually much harder to challenge those borders, both legally and also politically, in terms of social mobilization, in terms of contestation of these borders. So that's a static border. I want to say just very briefly a few words about the disappearing borders. So those of you in the room who would recall the 1990s, for example, the kind of literature that we saw in that moment in time, the post-Westphalian literature, of course, in part motivated or facilitated by the fact that, of course, in 1989, the Berlin Wall actually came down. And at the time, if you read back that literature, it's quite striking for us now in 2022 to just read the predictions that some of the scholars, leading scholars at the time, shared with their readers. The thought was that borders will become relics of a bygone era, that states as closed containers, as was the term that was used in the time, closed containers of power, you would be familiar with that term, will lose their authority, will lose their significance. As I said, will just become elements of a bygone era. So that was the prediction at the time. And again, we can spend more time on it. Clearly, those predictions did not dish out as anticipated. And we can have a discussion about why that is the case. But for the purposes of our discussion, what I want to share with you is the kind of alternative that I'm posing in the book. I'm proposing a third model, which I call the shifting border. And the shifting border, unlike the traditional static barrier, is not fixed in time and place. Instead, it's a border that is constantly in flux. It may penetrate, as I will show to you in my examples, deeply into the interior, just as it may stretch far, far, far away beyond the territory, operating potentially thousands of kilometers away from the actual protected, so to speak, home country. And what I want to also emphasize before we jump into the examples is that this shifting border, part of its brilliance as an institutional design, is the fact that it complements the static border. It can operate simultaneously. We can have very firm infrastructural elements, such as the rise of border walls, which operate simultaneously to the kind of shifting borders that I will describe to you. So to some extent, the static border has never disappeared. It becomes a backbone and part of what the regulatory mechanisms that I will describe to you, that because they permit shrinking and expanding the scope of migration regulation and border control, they just add additional layers, which make mobility that much more restrictive for those who are trying to enter, especially those who are trying to enter either as asylum seekers or those who are trying to enter without permission. And of course, I also want to emphasize that the territorial border as a concept still matters significantly. For sure, it matters for international relations. For sure, it matters in terms of a claim of self-determination. So all of my discussion about the shifting border suggests that this is complementary, making our discussion actually that much more sophisticated and complicated, because we want to account for both developments at the same time. And as I show in the book, one of the most remarkable developments in recent years is, in fact, that the border itself has become a moving barrier. In the sense, it's unmoored. It's a legal construct. That is the fixed black lines that we see in our Atlas books. As I said, they matter for certain purposes, but they no longer coincide or no longer exclusive with the kind of migration functions that may potentially, in our current world, may potentially, at least for richer countries, may potentially take place anywhere in the world. And at the theoretical level, the reason why I mentioned this is because it really challenges our basic assumptions, both about waning sovereignty, so the kind of disappearing border argument, about the demise of states and their ability to regulate mobility and control borders, but it also challenges or limits at least the kind of argument that we have seen quite prevalently on the national populist side, meaning the push to refortify border walls. Indeed, these border walls politically are very sellable, but even in those countries where these kinds of arguments are prevalent, to a great extent, the border wall is never the only measure of regulation. As I said, it's part of a whole suite of measures that are taken. And if you want to have an image, I'm referring, as I will show in the comparative examples in a minute, this shifting border is comprised of legal portals. To some extent, flash checkpoints are actually connecting to where Ettore ended his talk, rather than just a reliance on barbed wires and fences and walls, the kind of images that we're very, very familiar from the media. So the location as the border is shifting, And by shifting, by this ability to shift in multiple directions, the border becomes that much more significant, increasing the possibility and the reach of migration control of the countries that are implementing these shifting border techniques, again, contracting inward, extending outward, appearing, reappearing, disappearing, with very dramatic implications for the scope of rights and protections that migrants and non-citizens may enjoy. So this is by way of framework. So the traditional static border is there, but now it's reimagined as the last point of encounter rather than the first. So let me make this more concrete. I want to share with you a couple of examples. The first example that I'm sharing with you comes from the United States. And here I want to describe to you a major legal reform which occurred in the United States as part of the US immigration law and regulation policy. A procedure, a specific procedure, which I'll describe to you, called expedited removal, was introduced into law. Now, this legal provision permits frontline officers not only to, as the term says, expeditiously return, expedited return, not just to expeditiously return individuals who are tracked at the border. So this would be the traditional way of thinking about the static border, but also to review the status of the legal status of individuals who are detected up to 100 miles away from any US land and coastal border. And in the image that you have, this is the orange rim that you see in the slide. So in effect, the border is moving from its fixed location at the country's territorial edges. The border is extending, bleeding into the interior. Now, this legal authorization not only relocates the border, it also creates what has been referred to as the Constitution Light or Constitution Free Zone within the United States. So the slide I have for you here is from the ACLU. They are calling it Constitution Free. I think Constitution Light is actually a little bit more accurate. But the point is that within this 100-mile zone, law enforcement agents are permitted to set random checks anywhere without even having any probable cause. That is, they can put up checkpoints at highways, at ferry terminals, on trains, anywhere. And once those checkpoints are set up, any individual, any random individual may be asked to provide proof of their legal status in the United States. Now, again, we're very familiar with such governmental authority and surveillance of mobility, but traditionally it's restricted to a point where we cross an international border. What is happening here is that that same kind of technique of regulation is spilling into the interior. Now, you might think, I'm looking at the map, if you're looking at the map here, and you're saying 100 miles, how much of a difference would this sliding into the interior make in practice? If that's your thought, I would definitely want you to think again. In part because the most recent US census data tells us that no less than two-thirds of the US population actually resides within the 100-mile zone. Or another way to slice the data is this. We're talking about more than 200 million people who live in the malleable or movable border zones. And not only that, some of the major states, which are the highest immigrant attracting states, lie within the 100-mile zone. So the state of New York, for example, the state of Florida, and many, many other states that have a large immigrant population fall within this orange realm within the Constitution Light zone, the 100-mile zone. And what no less significant, the governmental agency that is responsible for managing the shifting border in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, has gone on record already very early, back in the early 2000s, declaring that in their interpretation of the law, this border enforcement regime may in fact expand nationwide. So in terms of their interpretation, anywhere in the border, anywhere within the border, for a period of up to 2 years, you may be asked about your legal status. And if you're detected to not have a proper status, not have the right documentation, you would be scheduled for deportation. So we can talk about that later on, but just in the interest of time, I want to move to our second example in our discussion here. So here we're moving to Canada. Canada, for its part, has actually perfected another technique of the shifting border, a technique of interdiction abroad, whereas effectively the country has relocated most of its immigration control and regulation activities to overseas gateways. These are gateways that are located primarily in Europe and Asia, were migration integrity officers. Sometimes you'll see them referred to as liaison officers, especially in the European context. This would be the terminology that you will find. Now conduct border control activities as a matter of course. And they also, as we heard, and there's a tremendous amount of research on this, and some of this work is delegated to third parties, private actors, in this particular case, either airline or airport personnel. So whereas in the United States, we've seen an example of the border bleeding into the interior, here the border stretches out well beyond the territorial frontiers of Canada. And again, this is part of a shifting border strategy that, as official government documents plainly and tellingly explain, the goal is to push the border out as far away as possible from the actual territorial border. And the idea is not only endorsed by the Canadian government, this has been taken on by many other governments throughout the world. The idea is to screen people at the source or origin of their journey rather than the end or the destination country. And then again, at every possible checkpoint along the continuum. So if you're looking at the image here, the traditional static border would be the land border just prior to arrival to Canada. And what the shifting border permits governments to do is actually to begin the regulation here at the outer rim, at the country of origin, then visa screening, airline check-in, points of initial embarkation, transit areas, point of final embarkation, arrival airports, and really depending on your journey, you might have a lot of transit points in addition to this image that you have here, which is officially from the Canadian Border Service Agency, which is the agency responsible for the implementation of this shifting border variant. And I want to suggest to you that the same logic, the logic of actually regulating people on the point, ideally in the mind of the regulator in the country of origin, the beginning or the beginning of the journey of the individual heading toward the inland, toward, in this particular example, Canada, but it could be another country as well. I want to suggest to you that the same logic has also informed the Canadian government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this actually fits very nicely with what we have heard about North America being the most fortified set of borders, not only in the physical infrastructure, as the examples have shown, but also in terms of shifting borders. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So you may know that in March 2020, when the pandemic started, when it became clear that the virus was no longer containable in any one country or any one region, Canada responded by taking unilateral action, and the unilateral action, and as I'll show later, this was not rare. Most countries actually took some similar unilateral action, but here the response was very dramatic in the sense of imposing a full global travel ban, which was in effect, and this would have been shocking to me or to anyone else who had written about borders up until the pandemic. This global ban was in effect for 2.5 years. In fact, just for us, it was lifted 3 hours today. It was the first time where our pandemic borders have been officially terminated. So 2.5 years after the pandemic started. And these pandemic border restrictions included random testing. They included a mandatory requirement that people will, when vaccination was available, reporting of vaccination. But even prior to that, all travelers to Canada, including citizens, which typically have an automatic right to enter, were subject to a tremendous body of regulation. But the one point that I want to suggest to you, which extends the logic of the shifting border, is what has been referred to as the electronic authorization prior to arrival. You might be familiar with it. This is something that Europe is also planning on introducing. In the Canadian example, this was a particular government application called ArriveCan, and that focused primarily on collecting pandemic-related information about the individuals and also requiring that they include a quarantine plan should they test positive at some stage. Again, as I mentioned to you, this was only removed today, September 26, 2022. But for the purposes of our interest, the reason why this was proven first efficient and be so attractive for the government agencies responsible for its introduction was the notion that this provided very crucial pre-arrival information. That is, to a great extent, it added a virtual wall prior to one's arrival to the territory. And of course, once you have a virtual wall, some people might be blocked. And even if you pass the virtual wall, that final physical arrival border still remains, and you might be restricted or not permitted entry on that last point of your journey. But the regulation begins much earlier on. So again, just to give you a sense of how these logics which occurred prior to the pandemic were later extended and implemented and accelerated in terms of their impact and in terms of their scope of reach, post-pandemic, and we can talk about that later on. And of course, real concerns about bias, transparency, accountability, when a lot of the regulation of actually checking your information on the ArriveCAN application occurs by airline personnel. But I want to first just quickly move to our third example, then I'll speak very briefly about the pandemic and I'll close. So the third example comes to us from Australia. And if you look at the image on the screen, you have Australia there. And Australia, even more explicitly than Canada and the United States, has officially relocated its border through the words of law, meaning that Australia created, as its own government readily admits, a distinction between the country's migration zone. Migration zone are these highlighted yellow bubbles that you see on the map, and Australia as we would know it as a sovereign entity. And this policy is referred to as the excision policy. It was created through primary legislation, through a law that passed through the Australian Parliament called the Migration Amendment Act. It was introduced in 2001. It was later expanded in 2005. That's the image you have here. And then again in 2013. And what this legislation does is it authorizes Australia's immigration officials to remove asylum seekers that have actually managed to reach Australia, but have reached Australia in one of these yellow bubbles, in one of these areas that are now considered an excised territory. And this is significant because although individuals reached the territory, although their bodies were actually on Australian soil, because of this policy of excision, it's a full legal fiction. The thought is that they never reached Australia. So although typically when you arrive to the border, your physical arrival on a territory activates a protection process, here Australia wanted to avert that. And in order to do so, they had to imagine parts of their own territory as if they are not part of Australia for the purposes of blocking the possibility for seeking asylum for individuals who arrived without permission by boat. And what this legal fiction does, it's very, very significantly limits both the procedural and the substantive rights that asylum seekers and other irregular migrants are otherwise entitled to under Australia's own domestic law, under international law as well. And in Australia, the policy was so strict that even the possibility of judicial review, of turning to a court and saying, we think this is unfair, even that element was abolished. So not only redrawing the territorial border, but also attenuating legality in the procedure. And in 2013, when the law was changed in the third iteration, the excision zone became extended. It was expanded to now include the entire continent of Australia, the entire Australian mainland. In effect, turning the excision zone into a border that applies everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And Australia's hardline was so persistent that those who actually reached the excision zone, the question emerged, if all of Australia is no longer, individuals cannot seek asylum there, what happens to them? They are physically on Australia's soil, so something had to be done. So partly this is one of Australia's major inventions, a very, in my opinion, troubling one, the notion of offshore processing centers. And if you look at the image that we have here at the bottom of the screen, individuals who arrived without permission under this policy, the excision policy, were shipped off far, far away to, in this example, to Nauruan Island, a small Pacific island, 4,500 kilometers away from Australia, where individuals were detained in certain cases for years while their asylum claims were processed and assessed. Now, Australia's policies, in addition to offshoring and in addition to declaring the whole territory as excised, also adopted a further element which closed the circle, which said that anyone who reached its border, its territory by boat without authorization, anyone who reached its excision zone, even if after years of waiting, their claim is proved to be justifiable, which actually a very high percentage of, in some years, almost 80% of the individuals who arrived in this way actually had credible claims, were entitled to refugee status. Even if that was the case, Australia declared that those individuals will never be able to settle in Australia. And this is the image that you have here, the no way. So this is the ad saying, even if you have a legitimate asylum claim, even if you reach Australia's territory, you will never, ever be able to settle here. You will never receive status in Australia. Again, part of a policy of deterrence. So to some extent, we can think about the excision zone as a black hole. It's like an original sin. If you arrive there, nothing, no subsequent action will ever permit you to overcome that initial entry, that initial encounter with a border that is shifting, that although you think you're on the territory, you actually have never reached the country that you were trying to reach, namely Australia. I emphasize this because we know that in the world of migration policy generally, and especially with restrictive immigration policies, because countries such as Australia, Canada, and the United States, and of course also the European Union would fall into this category. These are all countries that officially are strongly committed to protecting human rights. They're strongly committed to their asylum and refugee protection obligations. So although they are obliged to those, they're seeking to find ways that will allow them to both uphold those commitments, while at the same time deterring the possibility of individuals actually activating those processes, in part inventing the whole strategy of a shifting border in order to prevent the possibility of entry, at least when it comes for asylum seekers. And those policies, once they're introduced, something like Australia's policy, which itself is actually based on an earlier US policy, once that is operationable, and they're currently Australia's court have affirmed this policy, it may travel globally. So ideas, not just people, move globally. And I mentioned this because, as you know, Denmark now has a law that actually looks to offshoring, that tries to emulate the Australian model. And perhaps the most blatant example is, of course, the UK, which in 2022, in its Nationality and Border Bill, actually introduced a process which is very similar to Australia's. There's now an agreement with Rwanda, which is not yet, it cannot be implemented currently because the policy is under review by the courts. But once you have a policy that's operationable, it may transfer, as I said, across borders. If you want to read a little bit more about that, I've just published a piece on this emulation of restrictive immigration policies in the California Law Review. But just in the interest of time, I'll just take 3-4 minutes to close my talk and move to the second part, or the final part, talking about the governmental responses to COVID-19 and how the shifting border paradigm, to a great extent, has informed those policies. So here, I just want to remind you that when the pandemic broke, and actually I'm not going to have time to talk about Europe, but if you want to ask me questions about it, please do so later on. But just turning to the borders in the time of COVID-19, as you may recall, the image that I have here, or the world map that I have here, is an image from March 31st, 2020. So soon after the pandemic was declared as a global emergency, and the historians and probably a good number of dissertations will look back at this moment in time, but one of the immediate responses was the closure of borders, again, mostly unilateral, by countries deciding to close their own border in terms of inbound and outbound travel. And indeed, on March 31st, 2020, which is the image that we have here, close to 200 countries have actually imposed these full or partial travel bans, de facto engaging in self-closure or self-isolation at the national level. And indeed, at this point in time, we had roughly 90% of the global population was residing in countries that had introduced these travel restrictions in response to COVID-19. So this is absolutely unprecedented from what we know in human history. And I'm not saying this is a negative fact. We don't really know if this was indeed the correct response. Clearly, there was a shock, and that was the response, which was seen as responsible at the time. It was seen as necessary in the face of a global pandemic and a virus that no one really knew what the consequences might be, and there were no medical or pharmaceutical responses at the time. So again, it might be seen as a moment of saying each life counts, therefore we have to try and block the transmission of the virus. And it might be a sign of democracy and equality. We don't yet know how this will be judged, say, in 50 years or 100 years from now. But more significant for my talk with you is the question of how could this have been done? How was it possible in a world, deeply interdependent world, globalized world? How could it be that global mobility came to a halt with such a very, very short period of time, and with such a radical measures, with such radical consequences in terms of halting mobility. And here I want to suggest to you that governments were actually very familiar with techniques that allowed them to do so. That is, the various legally mandated bans on entry, and in most countries exit as well, relied very much on the logic of shifting borders. That is, we didn't have one battalion of soldiers had to move to the edges of the territory, as we would expect with a static border. No sack of cement was placed at the border, right? There was no physical infrastructure that was changed. Instead, some of the key rationales of the shifting borders that were already familiar to governments in terms of regulating mobility were just expanded on scale. Now, everyone, not just potentially unauthorized migrants, but everyone, including citizens, any possible any kind of mobility was regulated now under shifting border logics. Travelers were regulated prior to arrival. I gave you earlier the example of the app, but even before that, just when the pandemic started, people just had, if you recall, their temperature taken, and even a citizen would not be able to return to his or her home country if they were found to potentially have symptoms. So to a great extent, these measures that were familiar were implemented in terms of prior to arrival, outside of the border control, but also, and here I have an image which was taken during the pandemic. This is from Hong Kong. Many countries also introduced post-arrival. That is, even being in the territory didn't shelter you from the border's impact. That is, post-arrival, people had to comply with quarantine mandates. If you recall, in many countries, 14 days. In Hong Kong, there was also people also had to have this GPS wristband, which was connected to their smartphone. And in effect, that when they reached either their hotel room or their home, they had to walk around it and create a digital fence, an individualized digital fence, which was their quarantine border. And they had to comply with that. If not, there was actually an alarm. And this was Hong Kong. Actually, people regulated. If they were trying to escape their own digital fence, it was not a very good idea. They were actually detected. So the last example that I want to share with you is where I'll close. This is trying to pierce into the future. It's always quite dangerous to do so. But what can we learn beyond the pandemic, assuming that we've actually seen the worst of it? What might be the aftermath of these kinds of developments? And here I want to connect this actually to the kind of developments that we have seen pre-pandemic but were accelerated by this external shock. So governments in various countries which have very different regimes actually in terms of regulating mobility and in terms of their democratic authoritarian orientation. So China, the United States, Australia, the UK, the United Arab Emirates, and I could have listed others as well, have already prior to the pandemic began to develop various mechanisms or procedure in which the officials which were developing them and also the technology firms that were contributing to this we're imagining a future whereby both arriving and departing passengers will not require any travel documentation. That is, there would be no passports will be something of a past era. Instead, the vision here, or the thought was that these developers had introduced, was that our bodies, our physical biometric identifiers will become our ticket of admission, or conversely, what makes us marked for denial of entry. So biometric borders here have been already, they were already beginning. There was a good set of experiments already going on prior to the pandemic, but clearly we know that they have expanded their reach dramatically during the pandemic. And once these changes occur, it's very, very hard actually to scale them back. So just to give you one concrete example, you have here on the right-hand side an image from Dubai's International Airport from Terminal 3, and that airport, which is the International Arrival and Departure Terminal. And that airport already introduced a pilot, which is called, it's a new biometric border. In that particular airport, it's referred to as the Smart Tunnel. And what these tunnels do is they identify passengers through a combination of iris scan, and face recognition technology. And this appears as you walk through the tunnel. Now, here you have a static image, which is just an image of buildings. Typically, that type of a tunnel will have an aquarium where our eyes are naturally drawn to look and to move as they follow the fish. There were 80 cameras embedded in this smart tunnel. And as you walk through it, because your eyes are moving, you have both a better quality of the iris scan and the facial recognition. And this is partly a technology to ensure that indeed you are who you claim you are, the checkpoint here occurs virtually. That is, there's no passport, there's no human interaction unless you're stopped. Then there would be a secondary, you would be referred to a human. But the initial screening here depends on the algorithm that just matches you to the biometric information that is available about you. And if I just have 1 minute, I'll share the last example and then we'll close. Here I want to tell you about a pilot project bringing this back to Europe, a pilot project which you may be familiar with. That was quite futuristic and in some ways deeply unnerving. And a couple of years ago, the European Union funded this pilot project. It's called the iBorder Control, and it's a high-tech system that is designed to pre-screen incoming travelers. Of course, when it was tested, it never applied to EU citizens. It was only third country nationals that were subject to it. And what the iBorder Control units did is that were designed to perform a short, automated, I'm reading, non-invasive interview with an avatar. This is the little unit that you're interacting with, and which also included a lie detector. So these units were tasked with the responsibility of, first of all, verifying the identity of the traveler, and also they were designed to calculate a risk factor for each individual. Now, this risk factor, of course, is algorithmic. So this is an AI machine. We don't really know what kind of data was introduced into it. We don't know what the risk factors are. But the point is that in terms of implementation, it's quite consequential. That is, whatever risk factor you got calculated in that initial encounter will appear in any future bordering crossing. So anytime that you will be again checked, that number will come up. It may lead to further checks. It may lead to a denial of entry. And this particular AI, the algorithm, the way that it was calculated was not only to, as I told you, just to verify identity, but also to detect what it was referred to as human deception. And how is this determined? And this was highly controversial by micro gestures. That is, these are very subtle nonverbal cues, facial and bodily cues that none of us control. So to a great extent, the determination of that risk factor there was no human in the loop. And indeed, after the pilot test, the decision was that there's so many important ethical considerations and technological corrections that need to be made in order to ensure that there are no biases built into this kind of algorithmic decision-making. So just to give you a sense from the frontiers where it is that we are. So the shifting border is not only shifting inward and outward, which were my first examples, but also multiplying and fracturing. That is, each person, each one of us might in the future carry the border with us as we move across space and place. And I want to close with the following thought. As these examples illustrate, borders are clearly not vanishing. So we're not in that disappearing border universe. Rather, they are transforming. And they are transforming in a way that makes the shifting border at once multidirectional and slippery, but not in the transnational, open, and tolerant variant that the demise of state or post-Westphalian theories had predicted. Instead, what we're seeing is a much darker, a more restrictive orientation that has emerged. And far from the dream of a borderless world that has emerged after the Berlin Wall, the physical Berlin Wall came down, today, we find not only more border walls, as we heard in Ettore's talk, and not only more visa regulations, which are, as we heard, unequal in terms of their impact, but also, and many of these, at least the walls are typically erected on the global fault lines, but also we're seeing the rapid proliferation of movable legal barriers that are applied selectively and unevenly with fluctuating degree, intensity, and frequency of regulation. So no longer just a static border, the border has become a mobile, agile, sophisticated, ever-transforming legal construct, a shifting border. And because this shifting border can be planned and replanted in different locations with dramatic implications for the rights and protections of everyone who falls under its remit, I wrote this book. I want us to think through these issues, through their ethical, normative, legal, procedural implications, and of course, political, economic, legal as well, and political as well. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and I hope you can see my face and not just my screen. And I look forward to hearing your comments in the very few minutes that we still have for the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Ayelet. This was, you know, a rather somber talk about the current situation and the future, but also I think inspiring lots of questions. Now, the dilemma that we have is time is up. The reception is about to start in half a minute. I look to the organizers here, to our local hosts. Can we still have 1 or 2 questions for Ayelet and Ettore? Yeah. Okay. 10 more minutes maximum. Ayelet, I hope you can still stay with us for these additional 10 minutes. And Ettore, please join me here on the podium. And I'll look at you and I see a question there. Yes. Please move around the microphone. It's yeah.
Thank you so much for 2 really provocative papers. I wanted to ask Ettore that what was really interesting for me was, coming at borders and bordering from a very different perspective, which is, I was thinking about the historicity of borders, and actually borders having been imposed through colonial rule, being created and dividing populations in inappropriate ways. Communities that, you looked at the Zimbabwe, Zambia, actually we were interviewing people from the Benga community in both places. And so in effect, there is a question here about historicity of borders. And that's true here as well in Europe, because actually European borders have changed much more dramatically in the last 30 years. As you were also seen in the images, than in other places, than say in Africa. So there's something here about historicity, and I just wondered if you wanted to comment a little bit on how that might be a factor. And of course, the other thing that I was thinking about is political conflict and how that might be both political conflict, but also political unions. So for instance, like the East African community or so on and so forth, which alter the shapes of borders and how you would take that into account. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, we will just have 1 round of questions and then answers from Ettore and Ayelet. So who else wants to ask a question? Yes, please, Reina.
First, I wanted to thank the 2 speakers for, raising the issues that we have been discussing here. I think it has far-reaching consequences, including not knowing exactly where people are. New forms of mobility create implications for where do you get taxed in countries of draft, do you have to serve, in which military you have to serve, under which social security regime do you live, and so on. I think it has far-reaching implications that should not be forgotten. I wanted to make a link, as we are migration researchers here, to migration. Because when we look at the European case, and I assume the Canadian and the US-American case are not that different, we see that in a normal year, and not 2020, to which Ayelet Shachar has just alluded to, in a normal year, we have 500 million border crossings between the outside world and the Schengen area. We issue about 16 million Schengen visa, which means that it's only a tiny minority of non-EU residents that are crossing the border. We have 3 million first residence permits issued by the 27 EU member states. Or let's forget about Ireland, which is outside Schengen. The 25 or 26 that are relevant here. And of them, only 2 million are beyond 12 months, which counts as migration. Why I'm saying that? It means that 3% of all border crossings relate to Schengen, movements from third country nationals into Schengen, and only something like 3-4% are related to migration, in the sense that we used to define migration in the past as moving from one country to another for a period of 12 months. And so I think it's important to see that many of the border regimes that you, Ettore, and you, Ayelet, have been talking about have nothing to do with migration. Yeah, because it's about controlling territory or it's about controlling people. But negatively, they have implications for migration because they prevent people from even being able to migrate if they want. And I think the link that you have a border regime that controls everyone in order to manage migration that is 0.3% of all movements across borders, I think is an interesting point that I just wanted to make and would be happy if you would have a moment to comment on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Reina. It just reminds us how important it is to distinguish between mobility and migration and not confuse the two terms. Julia, and that will be the last question, I guess. Is there? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank to both speakers for the both very insightful and interesting presentations. I have a question for Ayelet. So Ettore has described to us how the key factor, or explained to us how the key factor explaining this porosity of the physical borders and of the visas that he looked at are really economic, right? Explaining the porosity of the physical borders, it's really the economic factor that's the most significant, and the effects of the visa policies as well. The effects are clearly economic. Now, you, of course, have an interest in this topic, but in the movable legal barriers that you have described, the shifting border in all three examples, they seem to apply, at least in terms of the legal technology, independent of economic or any other selection criteria. All three examples apply to everyone. So it's the 100 miles, anyone can be checked within the United States. It's the excised territory where anyone who arrives will not be able to stay. And it's the Canadian external checks that happen to anyone. Now, the effects we know, of course, are not the same, but could you maybe expand on this idea of how the relationship between this new shifting border and these mobile legal technologies, what's the relationship to economic criteria or other selective criteria that make them apply differently to different people? Thank you.
Excellent. Ayelet, I hope you have been able to understand well the questions. Yep.
Absolutely.
So I don't need to repeat or summarize, and I will just pass the microphone on to Ettore.
Yeah, very quickly because time is short. First question, thanks for raising the issue. Actually, I didn't emphasize enough that the data have a snapshot that kind of portray the situation as it is in recent years, a long-term or longitudinal take on the evolution of visa regimes and border control would definitely thicken our capacity of exploring the issues at stake, but we don't have the power to do that. Maybe historians could do and expand on these, or maybe these could be the first step for future research. As for Reinemund's question, yes, of course. The key word was mentioned in the question. The key word is deterrence, and actually there is a message that is given through visa costs and border controls, and it's deterring unwanted migrants. But it's true that also that there is a trade-off between, for instance, with visa costs, between deterring unwanted migrants, but also they need to incentivize wanted travelers that could foster the local tourist industry. So this is a tricky game for countries to manipulate and adjust visa costs in order to, to position themselves on the economic market for tourism, but at the same time playing their political game with migration.
Okay, so Ayelet, can you address any or all of the questions?
Sure, thank you. I hope you can hear me well. So thanks, these are three great questions, and in some ways, I think they're all tracking some similar trends that I would be happy just to quickly elaborate. So on the first question, just it was not directed to me, but on this question of coloniality, of history, of differentiating people, I think what the past teaches us is, first of all, it's very hard to actually overcome differences, even when you have a regime of equality. And partly, I think the current situation is, of course, in many ways very different from the past, because you cannot have the kind of explicit racial, for example, distinctions that you could have had in the past. So partly all these strategies of regulation, and I would also include here, actually, Ettore, your visa analysis. These are all ways in which countries, which recall all of us, we were covering, I was covering at least democratic rule of law societies, which are fully committed formally to formal equality. They are not permitted to discriminate on any basis, including economic basis. So I think partly the explanation for this, first of all, Reiner, on your question, to the overreach, right? To some extent, you can say, why is mobility so tightly regulated if the numbers of potential migrants, for example, is so extremely low as you cited? So it is about territoriality. It is about an assertion of state power. In some ways, there is a major legal debate about whether these powers really are have ever been given to states, or whether states have self-proclaimed that they have so many powers. There's a live debate in the United States about plenary power, the doctrine that says pretty much immigration law is waived from any standard regulation. And the question arises, why really? Why do we not apply our standard anti-discrimination laws to migration decision-making? So just to give you a sense, I agree with your analysis. It's much more about territoriality, about a very a strong assertion of sovereignty in a very specific way, and about mobility. And of course, it could have implications for migration. But I think even just mobility per se might disturb us if it's so skewed. That is, I would look at the numbers that you're giving us and ask, how could it be that the percentages of the third country nationals are in fact so low? So is it partly already a result of the kind of processes that Ettore tracks? That is, maybe more people would have liked to move if the costs were lower, etc. And here, this would connect me to Julia's question, which is a fantastic question, and I would require much more time to answer it, because in my thinking, the territorial kind of mechanisms that I have described of shifting borders are part of a much larger set of tools which have been developed by countries, again, operating under official mandates of equality and non-discrimination, but nonetheless trying to distinguish between potential entrants. So I think there are territorial elements, such as the shifting border, which I've described. There are cultural elements, which many of you in Europe would be very familiar with. So we can talk about the citizenship test, of various cultural integration requirements that individuals need to show. Here, moving us either from just visitors to people, say, family reunification cases, where, as you know, the Dutch introduced the pre-arrival cultural requirements. You need to show the A1 level of linguistic capacity. Other countries have also introduced other elements. So here it's a combination of the territorial and the cultural occurring even prior to arrival, let alone post-arrival. But also, I think there's a whole array of economic ways of regulating mobility, both at the top end and at the low end. At the top end, actually facilitating mobility, the super rich. I've written a lot about the marketization of citizenship, the commodification of citizenship. How could it be that some individuals can just transfer, and Reiner, of course, has written a lot about this, about, transfer more than 1 million euros, as Malta used to permit you, and gain an EU passport very quickly, a Maltese and then European passport very swiftly, whereas other people who have been on the territory for years are never eligible, in part for legal status issues, in part for cultural issues, but also diverse economic barriers at the entry level, and the sense of the kind of regulations that especially European countries have introduced in terms of minimal income, or 60 months of paying into a pension plan, et cetera, et cetera. I could elaborate. So I think that the reality is that these are all different mechanisms which, under a formal commitment to equality, are trying to sort in a way where states are trying to invite or welcome certain migrants and not others. But again, they are bound by their inability to rely on those old techniques of just saying, we're going to basically ban national origin. I mean, we know now in a war condition, things are different. We will have to see how much of a long-term impact this will have. But among the democratic peace, and when countries that trade with one another, typically you don't have a national origin barrier, or it would be very problematic, such as the travel ban in the United States. So typically you would not want to have these explicit barriers. So you're turning into these implicit barriers or these very combined, sophisticated techniques. But I do think all of them are in fact trying to maintain or sustain certain inequalities. But again, I also want to mention that because we're seeing these strategies, they can both restrict, but they can also facilitate. So a real full picture would even require us to have a more detailed analysis of who's targeted and what are the target populations which are actually gaining access through these changes that we're witnessing, who are the populations that are not gaining access. And just to give you a final example, I know we're closing in terms of time. Think about the different response at the Polish border to the Ukrainian asylum or refugees. They're not even refugees, they're temporarily protected individuals now, according to the EU regulation. So they're permitted to come in. They don't even have to, there's not the official process of determining refugeehood, which means you can have much quicker responses and accept many more people. But it also means that after the 3 years would have passed, we will have to see what occurs then. But that same border, you recall when people actually, when Belarus was bringing in people, that same border was absolutely locked. So it's even sometimes the same location, you would have different responses. And that, I think, invites us again to think, what are the reasons, what are the target populations, and how do you relate this back into questions of inequality, which I think I for sure am concerned about, but I think many other people in the room are, not just in the allocation, the initial allocation at birthright, but also in terms of mobility and potentially later on migration. And some of us are also looking at naturalization. So it's a long answer, but I want to bring the different themes together. And as I said, it would require a bit of a different lecture altogether to fully cover those points.